The auditorium held its breath. 400 soldiers sat in perfect rows, their uniforms pressed to razor edges, their backs straight as rifle barrels, their eyes forward in the particular way that military training creates, not just posture but a complete suppression of individual personality in favor of collective discipline. The ceiling fans turned slowly overhead, pushing around air that smelled of floor polish and sweat, and the particular tension that fills any room when senior military brass decides to make a point. General Harun Afridi walked across the stage with the unhurried confidence of a man who had spent 31 years being obeyed. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been hardened by desert campaigns and mountain operations into something that resembled geography more than human expression. He wore his uniform the way other men wore their skin, with complete unself-consciousness, and every medal on his chest represented something real and bloody and earned. He had commanded battalions, planned operations across 3 conflict zones, buried men he considered sons, and made decisions that historians were still arguing about in military academies across the country. He was also, according to 17 formal complaints filed with the military tribunal over the past 6 years, a bully. Not in any simple or straightforward way. General Afridi was too intelligent for crude cruelty. His bullying was precise, calculated, and deeply effective. He had a talent for identifying the particular weaknesses of people beneath him in the hierarchy and applying pressure to those weaknesses with surgical accuracy. Junior officers dreaded his inspections. Senior officers privately admitted to each other that his command style had cost the military talented personnel who had quietly requested transfers, rather than continue serving under him. But results counted in the Army, and Afridi produced results with a consistency that made his superiors willing to overlook the complaints and the transfers and the 16-month inquiry that had ultimately produced no formal censure. He stopped at the podium and surveyed the assembled soldiers with the expression of a man evaluating livestock at a market. His gaze moved methodically across the rows, pausing occasionally on faces he found wanting, never quite reaching the back row where the newest recruits sat. In the last seat of the very last row, Lieutenant Nadia Salim sat with her hands folded on her knees and her eyes fixed on the stage. She was 24 years old and had been a commissioned officer for exactly 93 days. She had graduated from the military academy at the top of her class in a year that had produced some of the most technically capable graduates in the institution's history, and her final evaluation scores had been circulated among the senior faculty with the kind of quiet admiration that academics reserve for genuinely exceptional students. None of that had prepared her for the reality of serving in a military institution that had been built by men like Afridi and remained, in its essential culture, a reflection of his values rather than the values written in its official code of conduct. She had been warned. Her mentor at the academy, a veteran officer named Brigadier Fatima Kurem who had spent 20 years navigating exactly these institutional currents, had told her clearly and without sentiment that the transition from academy excellence to field reality was the hardest thing she would face. Not the physical hardship, not the tactical challenges, the people, the hierarchy. The particular brand of resistance that institutions reserve for anyone who challenges their assumptions about who belongs in positions of authority. Nadia had listened carefully and filed everything Brigadier Kurem said in the part of her mind she reserved for intelligence that would prove operationally useful. She was not naive. She had grown up the daughter of a civil engineer father and a university professor mother in a household where competence was expected and excuses were not accepted, and she had long ago developed the particular combination of external composure and internal resolution that allowed her to absorb difficulty without being defined by it. But she was also 24 and 93 days into her first assignment, and sitting in an auditorium watching a man who held her career trajectory in his hands walk across a stage, and she would have been dishonest with herself if she claimed to feel nothing at all. Afridi reached the podium and began to speak. His voice was cultivated for command, deep and carrying, the kind of voice that could be heard over artillery fire. He spoke about standards. He spoke about the military's history and tradition and the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. He spoke about performance metrics from the previous quarter and what they meant for the unit's operational readiness. And then, without transition or obvious purpose, he began to speak about the current group of newly commissioned officers. He started generally, discussing the quality of recent academy graduates, the gap between theoretical training and practical performance, the challenges of integrating new personnel into established operational structures. His tone was professional and measured. The 400 soldiers in the auditorium listened with practiced attention. Then he said a name. He said Lieutenant Nadia Salim, and the entire auditorium seemed to lean slightly forward, though no one actually moved, and the temperature of the air changed in a way that was impossible to quantify but immediately perceptible. He said that Lieutenant Salim's academy performance had been impressive on paper. He paused, letting that phrase do its work. On paper. The implication was clear and deliberate. He said that academy excellence was a limited indicator of real-world capability. He said that recent field evaluations had raised questions about whether certain personnel were suited for the operational demands of the unit. He was looking directly at her as he said it. Nadia felt 400 pairs of eyes shift toward her in the particular synchronized movement of a crowd following a speaker's gaze. She did not change her expression. She did not look away from Afridi. She did not adjust her posture or betray any of the things she was feeling in that moment, because she had learned from Brigadier Kurram that public composure was not weakness but armor, and that showing pain to someone who was deliberately trying to cause it was the only way to guarantee they would continue. Afridi picked up a glass of water from the podium. It was a normal glass, the kind placed at podiums everywhere, filled with the routine water that speakers drink. He picked it up in the unhurried way he did everything, and he continued speaking, describing the field evaluation metrics, the performance gaps he had identified, the improvements he expected to see in the coming weeks. And then he turned to face her directly and poured the entire glass of water over his own head. The auditorium experienced collective confusion. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, the time required for 400 soldiers to process that their commanding general had just deliberately drenched himself while staring at a junior lieutenant in the last row. Then the confusion resolved into understanding, as Afridi handed the empty glass to an aide and said, clearly and precisely, that he had done this to demonstrate what he called the ability to remain composed under unexpected circumstances. He said that the test of a real officer was not the planned execution of known scenarios, but the response to complete surprise. He said that composure under shock was the foundation of tactical decision-making. He said that anyone who could not maintain complete control of their physical and emotional response when confronted with the unexpected would fail the moment that actual operations demanded that control. He was still looking at Nadia. Then he said that Lieutenant Salim would now come to the stage and demonstrate this principle for her colleagues. The auditorium was so quiet that the ceiling fans sounded like helicopter rotors. Nadia understood immediately what was happening. This was not a test of composure in any meaningful tactical sense. This was a performance of power. Afridi was going to pour water on her head in front of 400 soldiers, and whatever her response was, he had structured the situation to guarantee her humiliation. If she protested, she was insubordinate. If she came to the stage and stood there while he did it, she was humiliated. If she showed any visible reaction to being drenched, she failed his stated test of composure. If she showed no reaction, she still sat down afterward knowing that a general had chosen to demonstrate his authority by using her body as a prop in front of her entire peer group. There was no clean exit from the situation he had created. That was the point. That had always been the point. She stood up. Her footsteps were quiet on the floor between the rows. She walked at a measured pace, not hurried, not hesitant, with the particular economy of movement that she had developed over years of athletic training and refined at the academy. She was aware of every eye in the room following her, aware of the absolute silence that had replaced the ambient noise of 400 people breathing and shifting, aware of Afridi watching her approach with the expression of someone who has already decided how this story ends. She climbed the 3 steps to the stage. She crossed to the center. She stood in front of him and met his eyes with the same steady directness she had maintained throughout the auditorium. He held up a fresh glass of water that an aide had already prepared. He held it at shoulder height and looked at her with an expression that was simultaneously daring her to react and promising that whatever she did, he had already won. She said nothing. She did not adjust her stance. She did not look at the glass or away from his face. She simply stood and waited. He poured the water on her head. It was cold, the way water left in air conditioning always becomes cold, and it hit the top of her head and ran down her face and soaked into the collar of her uniform. She felt it against her scalp and down the back of her neck and along her jaw. It was a significant amount of water, deliberately chosen for maximum visual impact. She did not blink. Not once. Not the involuntary reflexive blink that humans produce when water strikes their face. Not a slow, purposeful blink. Not the rapid flutter of someone struggling to control themselves. Her eyes remained open and fixed on Afridi's face with an expression of such complete, unshakable composure that the auditorium, which had collectively expected some kind of visible reaction, remained frozen in its silence. Afridi had poured water on people before. Twice, according to the complaint files. Both previous times, the recipients had either winced or blinked or shown some flash of the shock and humiliation that was the entire purpose of the exercise. He had been able to stand before his troops and narrate their reactions as evidence of inadequate composure, turning their very human responses into performance metrics that justified his cruelty. Nadia gave him nothing. For 4 heartbeats, they stood face to face on the stage, water dripping from her jaw onto the floor, and she looked at him with an expression that conveyed nothing except complete, absolute, unassailable calm. Then she said, without any inflection or edge or the faintest tremor, that she was ready to return to her seat if the demonstration was complete. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had preceded it. It was the silence of 400 people recalibrating. Afridi's expression did not change in any way that could be formally described or documented, but something shifted behind his eyes, some small recalculation, and he said, his voice entirely controlled, that she could return to her seat. She descended the stage steps with water dripping from her chin and walked back to her seat in the last row and sat down, and resumed exactly the posture she had held before he called her name. She folded her hands on her knees. She fixed her eyes on the stage. She made no gesture toward her soaked uniform, did not touch her wet hair, did not exchange glances with the soldiers sitting nearest to her. Afridi continued the address. His voice was steady and his manner was professional, and he covered the remaining agenda items with the efficiency that characterized everything he did. But the energy in the auditorium had changed in a way that was palpable and irreversible. 400 soldiers had watched a general pour water on a junior lieutenant's head, and had watched that lieutenant look at him without blinking, and whatever authority the act was supposed to demonstrate had instead performed something different, something that no one in the room could have predicted. When the address concluded and the soldiers were dismissed, Nadia remained in her seat while others filed out. She was aware of the looks, the murmured conversations, the particular attention that attaches itself to someone who has just become the center of a public event. She waited until the auditorium had largely emptied before she stood, and when she walked out, She walked with the same measured pace she had used on the way in. She went directly to the bathroom, locked herself in a stall, and stood for exactly 2 minutes, allowing herself to feel everything she had suppressed on that stage. The anger, the humiliation, the exhaustion of having to turn another person's cruelty into an opportunity to prove herself. The profound weariness of being 24 years old and already so practiced at not reacting to provocations that it had become a kind of automatic override. Then she unlocked the stall, went to the sink, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her uniform was still wet. Her hair was still plastered to her head. She looked exactly like someone who had just had water poured on them in front of 400 people. She looked at her own reflection for a long moment. Then she straightened her collar, pressed her wet hair back from her face, and left the bathroom. What happened next did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened over the following weeks in the accumulation of small but significant events that anyone paying close attention could have tracked. The first thing was that the footage circulated. The auditorium had official recording equipment that captured all formal addresses, and within 48 hours, edited copies of the water pouring incident had moved through the informal networks that exist in every military institution regardless of official communication protocols. By the end of the first week, the footage had been seen by personnel at 3 other bases, 2 civilian oversight officials, and a journalist who covered military affairs and had been investigating Afridi's record for the past 8 months. The second thing was that Nadia did her job. Not in any dramatic fashion, not in a way designed to draw attention or prove a point to anyone watching. She simply showed up every day and performed at the level she was capable of, which was considerably higher than anyone except herself had expected. She ran training scenarios with a precision that her unit's senior sergeant, a veteran named Yusuf Qureshi who had served under 7 different officers and trusted exactly 3 of them, described in his informal assessments as the clearest tactical thinking he had seen from an officer of any rank in 6 years. She made decisions under pressure with a quality that is genuinely rare and essentially unteachable. The ability to process multiple competing variables simultaneously and arrive at correct conclusions faster than the situation deteriorated. In a training exercise 3 weeks after the auditorium incident, she made a command decision that redirected her entire unit away from a simulated ambush that every other element of the exercise was walking directly into, calling it from terrain analysis and behavioral pattern recognition before a single shot was fired. Qureshi wrote his assessment of that decision and sent it up the chain of command without being asked. The third thing was that people began to talk, not publicly, not in ways that could be cited or documented, but in the way that things are discussed in military institutions when something has happened that cannot be officially acknowledged. The story of the water glass became a kind of shorthand. Officers who had filed complaints over the years and been told their concerns were not actionable began to compare notes with a new sense of purpose. Afridi's previous targets had been individually isolated and therefore individually manageable. The auditorium incident had been witnessed by 400 people simultaneously, and there was no version of it that could be reframed as a performance evaluation. Nadia was aware of all of this. She had been trained in intelligence analysis, after all, and she understood institutional dynamics with the same precision she applied to tactical problems. But she was careful not to insert herself into any of it, not to become the center of a movement, or allow her professional conduct to be conflated with any external narrative about the general. She was not interested in Afridi's destruction. She was interested in her career, in the work, in the mission. She had made that decision in the bathroom mirror, and she held to it. 5 weeks after the auditorium address, General Afridi received formal notification that the military tribunal was reopening the inquiry into his command conduct. The notification cited new evidence, new witnesses, and a pattern of behavior that previous investigations had failed to adequately assess. He was temporarily relieved of direct command authority pending the inquiry's outcome. When the notification was made public within the institution, Nadia was in the field running a training operation with her unit. Qureshi told her when she returned to base, his expression carrying the careful neutrality of someone who has strong feelings he is choosing not to express. She listened, thanked him, and went to write her post-exercise report. The inquiry lasted 4 months. 17 officers and 43 enlisted personnel gave formal testimony. The complaint files from the previous 6 years were reviewed in their entirety. The auditorium footage was entered into evidence along with footage from 2 other incidents that had previously been dismissed as command prerogative. Afridi was found to have engaged in a sustained pattern of conduct that violated the institution's code, created a hostile environment that had driven away qualified personnel, and constituted an abuse of command authority. He was formally censured, stripped of 2 decorations, and retired with reduced pension. His service record, which had been a matter of institutional pride, would now carry a formal notation. On the day the inquiry's findings were announced, Nadia was in a briefing with her unit. She heard about it from Qureshi afterward, who handed her a printed summary with the same careful neutrality. She read it once, folded it, and put it in her pocket. Qureshi watched her and said that he had to ask her something. He said that in 30 years of service he had seen things that should have broken people, had watched the institution do its worst to individuals who deserved better, and had developed a kind of measured resignation about justice and outcomes. He said that he wanted to know how she had stood on that stage without blinking. Nadia considered the question for a moment. She said that she had been training her blink reflex for 11 months. She had read about voluntary suppression of involuntary reflexes in a sports psychology study and had practiced in front of mirrors and underwater spray until she could override the blink response for up to 40 seconds. She had not known when or whether she would ever need the ability. But she had developed it anyway, because the particular challenge of suppressing a reflex that the human nervous system performs automatically had seemed like a precise metaphor for the larger skill she was trying to build. The skill of not giving anyone the reaction they are trying to provoke. Qureshi was quiet for a moment. Then he said that in 30 years he had met perhaps 4 officers with that quality, and that she was going to be either extraordinary or exhausted by the time she reached his age, and probably both. She said that she was already exhausted and that it had not stopped her yet. He nodded and said that was usually how it worked. She went back to work. The weeks that followed the inquiry's conclusion were different in the way that environments change when a consistent pressure is removed. The particular atmosphere that had characterized the unit under Afridi's authority, the careful self-censorship, the constant performance of confidence that was actually concealment of anxiety, the exhausting calculation of whether any given action might attract unwanted attention, began to ease by degrees. It did not disappear overnight because institutional cultures do not dissolve overnight, but the temperature changed. People spoke in meetings with slightly more directness. Junior officers raised concerns without the same practiced hesitation, small things that signaled a larger shift. Nadia noticed all of it and said nothing, because she understood that the worst thing she could do for the environment's natural evolution was to draw attention to it. The officer appointed to temporary command, while a permanent replacement was selected, was Brigadier Layla Mahmoud, a 30-year veteran whose record was outstanding and whose reputation for rigorous but fair command was well established. She arrived at the base and conducted individual meetings with all unit leaders within the first 72 hours. When Nadia's turn came, Mahmoud closed the office door and looked at her across the desk with an expression that was professional and direct. She said that she had reviewed the complete performance file, including Qureshi's assessments, and that she had some thoughts about Nadia's development trajectory, and the kinds of assignments that might suit her capabilities. Nadia listened carefully. Mahmud said that she was going to be direct because she considered it disrespectful to be otherwise. She said that what Nadia had done in the auditorium had not been simply a demonstration of composure. It had been a strategic act, whether or not Nadia had consciously framed it as such in the moment. By removing herself from the role of victim, by responding to a calculated humiliation with such complete equanimity that the humiliation could not attach itself, she had shifted the dynamic of the entire event. 400 witnesses had watched a general pour water on a junior lieutenant, and had watched the junior lieutenant look at the general as though he had done something entirely ordinary. And the effect of that on the general's authority was something that no formal complaint or tribunal could have achieved. Nadia said that she had not been thinking in those terms in the moment. She had been thinking about not blinking. Mahmud said that was exactly the point. The best strategic acts were the ones that came from a deep foundation of prepared instinct rather than conscious calculation. Calculation was too slow. Foundation was what held under pressure. She said that she was going to recommend Nadia for the Advanced Tactical Command Program, which was a 2-year assignment that produced the institution's next generation of senior officers. The program was intensely competitive and had an attrition rate of 40%. She said that she was confident Nadia would not only complete it but would likely perform in the top tier of her cohort. She said that she was telling her this not to inflate expectations, but because she believed that people performed better when they understood the context of the challenges they were entering. Nadia said that she understood and that she was grateful. Mahmud said that gratitude was unnecessary. She said that identifying and developing exceptional talent was not generosity, it was professional obligation, and that the institution had failed in that obligation for too long in too many cases, and that she intended to be rigorous about it going forward. She said one more thing before dismissing Nadia. She said that the 11 months of blink reflex training, the preparation for a moment that might never have come, the maintenance of capability in the absence of opportunity, that was the truest indicator she had seen in a long time that someone understood what the work actually required. Nadia returned to her unit and did not mention the conversation to anyone. 6 weeks later, she received the formal notification of her acceptance into the Advanced Tactical Command Program. She read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same pocket where she had stored the printed summary of Afridi's inquiry findings. Then she went to find Qureshi to tell him that she would be leaving the unit and to express what she actually felt about having served alongside him, which was more than she typically expressed about anything. He listened, nodded once, and said that he had known it was coming since the day of the training exercise where she had called the ambush. He said that officers with that quality of decision-making did not stay in their first assignments. She said that she had learned from watching him, which was true. He said that she had brought something to the unit that was harder to quantify than any metric in any evaluation file, which was the evidence that competence was not determined by rank or size or how long you had been doing the work, but by the quality of thinking you brought to it. He said this in the straightforward, unsentimental way of someone who had spent 30 years in an institution that did not typically reward sentiment, and Nadia received it in the same spirit. She left the base 3 weeks later on a clear morning when the light was the particular gold of early hours before heat had fully established itself. Her kit was packed efficiently into the vehicle, and her paperwork was complete. She had said her goodbyes the previous evening, which seemed cleaner than morning farewells. Before she drove out through the gate, she allowed herself a single, private moment of reflection on everything that had happened in the past 6 months. The auditorium, the water, Afridi's expression when she had not blinked, the inquiry, Mahmud's office, the program notification folded in her pocket. She thought about the bathroom mirror afterward, and the 2 minutes she had allowed herself to feel everything before straightening her collar and leaving. She thought about the 11 months of preparation before she had ever known the opportunity would come. She thought about Brigadier Kuram at the academy, who had told her that the hardest thing would be the people and the hierarchy and the institutional resistance, and who had also told her, in the same conversation, that the institutions that tried hardest to keep capable people out were the ones that needed them most urgently and would ultimately be changed by them most profoundly. She drove through the gate as the sun cleared the eastern wall and painted the road ahead in clean, uncomplicated light. She had a program to complete, work to do, and a long career ahead of her in an institution that was, by degrees that were slow but measurable, beginning to resemble the values written in its official code of conduct, rather than the practices of the men who had shaped its culture. She was 24 years old, and she was just beginning. The water had dried months ago, the work had not.